Welcome to The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a production of LibertyNation.com, hosted by Mark Angelides.
As discussed in the last edition of The Rabbit Hole, color is more than just a reflection of light. It's a political tool used to persuade, to encourage, and lead the masses to commit to decisions they may not otherwise take. We examined how the Democratic and Republican parties got their colors, and how the politicization of blue and red comes with connotations that spur us to action. But there's a whole rainbow to choose from when dissecting the colors of politics. In this edition, I want to look back in time at how color has been used as a signal in both war and leadership, and how many of these indicators still exist for us today in the present. The most obvious use of color to determine one's affiliation is that of military wear. When we think about battles raged across an open plain, we often envisage uniforms worn by the combatants, all marching in line in one united force. But this is not quite true. In fact, the idea of a codified uniform is not really something that came about fully, as in it was something the average civilian might recognize as a unifying outfit, until the mid-1600s with Oliver Cromwell. Before this, there was actually a lot of variety in the clothing and colors, and of course in what those colors meant. In the 7th or 8th century BC, in ancient Greece, there were the infamous Spartan hoplites. The name hoplite was translated as equipment because each soldier would have similar equipment, but later translations suggest it means infantry. These hoplites were made up of the middle classes of the various Greek city-states, the middle classes being the only ones who could afford the required equipment. But in Sparta, almost all military-age men were hoplites. Two aspects define these soldiers, the first being the fighting formation they used, that of the phalanx. It's a devastating approach that ensured all men were acting as one unit. The second being the gear, the weapons they carried. Each soldier would take a spear, a shield, and a sword, and they would, if they could afford it, wear a form of body armor too. Yet these weapons were not standardized. They were more often than not handed down from father to son. The concave shields they carried were called aspis, and they were more often than not decorated with a family or a clan emblem to show who they bore allegiance to. So what was it that separated them from the opposing army? Many sources suggest that these Spartan warriors would wear a red tunic or a red cape, or both. Now, the cape was likely removed before battle as it could hinder movement or be an easy target to be grabbed from behind. But there are some interesting facts about why they would don red. Firstly, red was the color of Ares, the god of war. By having his color present on the battlefield, they were honoring him and asking for favor in the outcome. Ares' food was the blood of men, and he was often predicted as having a shield full of gore. And of course, his planet was Mars, the red planet even today. The second reason the Spartans chose to wear red gives us a real insight into how sophisticated these supposedly noble savages really were. It was psychological warfare. You see, the Spartans knew full well that having their opponents fear them was a devastating advantage. It's a reputation that they sought to foster, that they were warriors who couldn't be defeated in battle. It pushed their enemies to act defensively and to be cautious. If the Spartans were injured in battle, it covered any spilling of the blood, making them seem invincible, and of course not making them appear the easier target. We can see this use of red in later military endeavors also. The New Model Army formed in 1645 and most closely associated with Oliver Cromwell, although he himself had to resign his post with the new self-denying laws. These soldiers were kitted out with red coats. There doesn't appear to be a symbolic meaning behind this choice, rather that the material was sourced from the lowest bidder. But the idea of red military men stuck and became the color of choice for centuries later. In fact, it wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that bright colors were phased out for soldiers in combat situations. There are all too often practical reasons for the choice of color. In the United Kingdom, soldiers today wear an olive green khaki because it's historically the best color for camouflage, essentially not making the individual an identifiable target against a backdrop. But of course, Many of the major theatres of war nowadays are in the Middle East, and as such, overseas servicemen will wear a light tan uniform. Napoleonic soldiers wore a distinctive white uniform, very bright, with a coloured overcoat. Now, why they did this exactly is a somewhat contested issue. One side presents the argument that Napoleon, who certainly understood flair and style, being a leader who spent ample time designing his own uniforms, likely wanted his troops to look pristine at all times. While the other armies would be wearing any old clothes they had, he wanted his men to stand out and never looked fatigued or broken. And then there's the other school of thought, which says that due to the British naval blockade, France was unable to get the dyes that they needed. The reality is probably a mix of both. We've discussed soldiers and their uniforms, but what of wars? And more importantly, what of revolutions? Starting with the Yellow Revolution, or the People Power Revolution in the Philippines in 1986, these color revolutions have been a staple of the last 35 years. The Yellow Revolution came about as a revolt against former President Ferdinand Marcos and, to a lesser extent, his infamous wife, Imelda Marcos. But why was it yellow? Well, the protesters would wear a yellow ribbon as a nod to the song "Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree" by Tony Orlando. The spark of this revolution was the assassination of Senator Benigno Aquino Jr., who, after 3 years of self-imposed exile, had returned home. He was murdered on the tarmac right after landing. And as the song explains, "It's been 3 long years. Do you still want me?" And let's not forget what's happening in France right now. Although pretty much all media coverage has stopped, every weekend thousands of yellow vest protesters shut down the streets of Paris and engage in quarrels with the military-style police, the gendarmerie. Fires, tear gas, injuries, and still the occasional death. But of course, Emmanuel Macron is a darling of the left-leaning media and committed globalist. Therefore, it goes against the agenda to show the world that a revolution is taking place in one of the world's most important economies. We're allegedly in the information age, but it seems the information is only to go one way. The media, governments, and supranational organizations, they understand the power of colors. They seek to use the inherent connotations for their own ends while hiding the events unfolding today, all over the world. Colors are powerful things, and unless we understand their importance and their significance, it will never be the actual real people who wield that power.
Go deeper on the topic discussed in this video, head on over to one of these links here or go to our Liberty Nation Roku channel. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for Liberty.
The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a LibertyNation.com production. Available at Libsyn, Apple iTunes, Stitcher, on Roku, and other fine podcast providers.